My mother-in-law smirked and demanded I pay every bill since I lived in her family house. So I smiled and said I would move back into the house I already owned, and my husband's face went sheet white. The dining room went quiet in a way that had weight to it, not the polite quiet of people chewing, the quiet of a held breath. The pot roast Sylvia had made sat half-eaten in the center of the table, steam still rising off it, and the good china, the set she only brought out for holidays and Sunday dinners, caught the light in a way that made the whole scene look staged for a photograph nobody had asked to take. Sylvia Whitfield sat at the head of the table with her wine glass turned just so, catching the light from the chandelier she was so proud of. She had that smile on, the one that looked like warmth from across the room and looked like something else entirely up close. "Since you're living under my roof, Vivian," she said, "I think it's only fair you start covering your share of every bill. All of them. Every month." She said it the way you'd announce a change in the weather. Casual. Final. Like she was doing me a favor by explaining the obvious. Like the math had already been settled somewhere upstream of this conversation, and I was simply the last person being informed of it. Grant's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He didn't look at his mother. He looked at me, and there was something close to panic behind his eyes, like a man watching two cars drift toward each other and knowing he couldn't reach the wheel of either one. I set my own fork down. I took my time doing it. "That's an interesting thought," I said, "but I think I'll just move back into the house I already own." I said it gently. I even smiled while I said it. Sylvia's expression didn't change right away. It took a full second for the meaning to land, and when it did, her mouth opened slightly, like she wanted to say something and couldn't find the shape of it. Grant's face went white. Not pale. White. The color drained out of him so fast it looked almost medical, like I'd said something with a diagnosis attached. Neither of them said a word. I picked my fork back up and finished my green beans like nothing had happened, because by that point, nothing that happened at that table could surprise me anymore. I already knew everything. I'd known for 11 days. To understand why one sentence could empty the blood out of a grown man's face, you have to go back 4 months, to a wedding, a moving truck, and a house I was told I'd only be living in temporarily. My name is Vivian Reyes. I was 34 years old that January, and I'd spent the last 9 years working in financial compliance, which is a boring way of saying I read documents for a living and I noticed things other people miss. Loan applications, escrow statements, the specific language banks use when they want you to sign something without reading it. I worked for a firm called Ashcroft and Weiss in downtown Columbus, in a job that had made me careful in a way that had nothing to do with paranoia. It was just pattern recognition. Numbers tell the truth eventually. People don't, not always, but numbers do. I met Grant Whitfield at a friend's engagement party 2 years earlier, in the fall. He was 36, worked as a regional sales manager for a logistics company called Corvail, and had the kind of steadiness I hadn't experienced in a relationship before. He called his mother every single day at 6 in the evening, like clockwork. I used to think that was sweet. I told my sister once that a man who calls his mother every day is a man who knows how to show up for people. I didn't understand yet that showing up and being owned by someone are not the same thing, and that with Grant, the line between them had been blurred a long time before I ever met him. Looking back, there were signs even before the wedding, though I filed them under family quirks instead of warnings. Sylvia inserted herself into every stage of the wedding planning, not as a helpful mother-in-law, but as something closer to a co-owner of the event. She vetoed the venue we'd originally chosen, a small vineyard 40 minutes outside Columbus, in favor of a banquet hall in Cedar Falls that had hosted. She informed me more than once, every Whitfield wedding since 1961. She rewrote the guest list twice without asking, adding cousins and old family friends I'd never met, and quietly trimming 2 of my college roommates to make room for them, explaining that the hall had a capacity limit and family had to come first. Grant, when I brought it up, told me it wasn't worth the fight. "She just wants to feel included," he said. "Let her have this one." I let her have it. I didn't yet understand that with Sylvia, there was no such thing as one thing. The first time Grant brought me home to meet her, over a year before the wedding, Sylvia had looked me over at the door for a beat too long and then said, to Grant rather than to me, "Well, she's certainly put together." I laughed it off at the time, assumed it was an awkward compliment from a woman meeting her son's girlfriend for the first time. It took me 2 years to understand she'd been assessing something else entirely, cataloging what I had and what it might eventually be worth to the family, the way you'd size up a property before deciding whether it was worth the paperwork to acquire it. Grant proposed in April at the overlook above Cedar Falls Old Quarry Park, on a Saturday morning we'd originally planned as a simple hike and nothing more. He'd asked my father's blessing years too late to actually receive it, since my father had been gone by then for 5 years. But he told me, kneeling in the wet grass with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, that he'd asked Sylvia instead, out of respect, since she was the only parent either of us had left in the picture that mattered. He looked so certain kneeling there in the wet grass, so sure he was doing something right, that I said yes, before I'd even fully processed the part about Sylvia. I remember thinking it was sweet at the time, a small gesture toward family continuity. I didn't yet understand that in the Whitfield family, asking permission and requesting a stake were often the same motion, worn to look like 2 different things. My sister Marisol, who flew in from Phoenix for the final dress fitting, was the first person who said anything out loud. We were standing in a bridal shop parking lot, and she asked me, out of nowhere, whether I'd noticed that every conversation about the wedding somehow ended up being about what the Whitfield family had always done, never about not what I wanted. I brushed it off. I told her Sylvia just had strong opinions and a lot of history in that town. Marisol didn't push it, but she gave me a look I recognized. The same look our mother used to give when she suspected something was wrong and knew better than to say so twice. There was a specific afternoon, 6 weeks before the wedding, that I only understood the shape of much later. Sylvia had taken me to look at reception centerpieces, and over lunch afterward, she'd asked, almost idly, whether Grant and I had discussed how things would work financially once we were married. I told her we hadn't gotten that specific yet, that we were still figuring out logistics. She nodded, patted my hand, and said something I wrote off at the time as old-fashioned sentimentality. Marriage works best, she said, when everyone's resources serve the family as a whole. Walter and I never kept anything separate, not from the day we married. I remember smiling and changing the subject, the way you do with a comment that feels slightly uncomfortable, but not worth examining. I didn't examine it again until January, sitting in my car outside the recorder's office, when it stopped sounding like sentimentality and started sounding like a mission statement. We got married on September 12th at a small venue outside Cedar Falls, Ohio, the town where Grant had grown up. Sylvia cried through the whole ceremony. I remember thinking, at the time, that it was the crying of a mother who loved her son. It took me months to understand it was closer to the crying of a woman watching something she considered hers get harder to control. I owned a house. That part matters, so I'll say it plainly, the way I'd have said it in a deposition. When I was 29, my father, Manuel Reyes, passed away and left me enough to buy a small 3-bedroom house outright, no mortgage, at 42 Larkspur Lane, on the other side of Cedar Falls from the Whitfields. I'd lived in it for 5 years before I met Grant. It was the most stable, most mine thing I had ever owned, and I loved it the way you love something that came from grief and turned into safety. A week after the wedding, Grant brought up moving into his mother's house. The Whitfield house, on Maple Ridge Road, had been in the family for 3 generations, a white colonial with black shutters and a wraparound porch that Walter had rebuilt himself the decade before he died. The kind of house that photographed well for the town's holiday tour and carried in every room some small plaque or framed photo reminding you whose house it had always been. Grant's father, Walter Whitfield, had died 6 years earlier of a heart attack, and Sylvia had lived there alone ever since, in a 5-bedroom colonial that was, by any reasonable measure, too big for one person. Grant framed it as practical. We'd move in temporarily, save on our own mortgage or rent, and put my house on the rental market instead. Extra income. A short-term arrangement while we saved for something of our own down the road. It's just numbers, he told me, over dinner at our apartment, the one we'd have to give up. We'd be smarter putting your place to work instead of living in it and paying nothing toward equity somewhere else. It sounded reasonable. I want to be honest about that, because hindsight makes people sound smarter than they were in the moment, and I don't want to do that to the version of myself who said yes. It sounded reasonable because Grant was careful about how he said it, and because I trusted him, and because trusting your husband is supposed to be the baseline, not the exception. We moved into the Maple Ridge house on September 20th. I found tenants for Larkspur Lane within 2 weeks, a young couple named the Delgados, paying $1,450 a month, which went straight into a savings account Grant and I opened jointly at a credit union downtown. I remember feeling, that first week on Maple Ridge Road, like an adult making a mature financial decision. I remember Sylvia hugging me in the kitchen and saying how nice it was to have a full house again. For the first 2 weeks, it genuinely did feel like an adjustment rather than a warning. Grant and I fell into a rhythm, Sunday grocery runs together, evenings on the back patio, while Sylvia watched her shows inside. The ordinary textures of a new marriage settling into a new house. I told myself the version of married life I'd imagined was simply arriving a little differently than I'd pictured it. Borrowed walls instead of our own, temporary instead of permanent. I believed, genuinely, that we'd be out within a year, in a house with both our names on it, and that this stretch on Maple Ridge Road was nothing more than a bridge. There was one moment early on that I filed away without understanding its weight. 3 days after the wedding, before we'd even moved, Grant sat me down at the kitchen table in our old apartment and said, almost offhand, that it might make sense to add his name to the deed for Larkspur Lane. Just for simplicity, he said. In case anything ever happens to you, or to me, it keeps things clean. No probate mess. I told him I wasn't ready to do that yet. It wasn't a no forever, I said. Just a not yet. It had been my father's money. I wanted to sit with the idea before I changed something that permanent. He nodded, said he understood, dropped it. But I remember Sylvia had been in the room. She'd come by to bring over a casserole dish, and she was standing near the doorway when Grant asked, and I remember the flicker on her face when I said no. It wasn't anger. It was closer to disappointment, the look of someone recalculating. At the time, I thought nothing of it. It was such a small moment. It took me 4 months to understand it was the first domino, set up and waiting. What I didn't know yet, and wouldn't learn until Renee told me months later, was that Sylvia wasn't short on money at all. Walter had left her comfortably provided for. A paid-off house, a pension, and a life insurance payout that had gone, according to Renee, largely untouched. The bills that started arriving weren't about scarcity. They were about testing, a slow, methodical exercise in seeing how much I would absorb without pushing back, and more precisely, whether I was the kind of person who kept score. I was. I just didn't let anyone see me doing it. The bills started the first week we lived on Maple Ridge Road, and each one, on its own, sounded fair. The first was utilities. Sylvia handed me a printed statement at the kitchen counter, already highlighted, already totaled. $240 our share, she said, for the month. It made sense on its face. 3 adults in a house instead of 1 meant a higher bill, and splitting it evenly seemed like a normal cost of shared living. I paid it without complaint, transferring the money from our joint account into hers with a note that said, October utilities. I thought that was the ceiling. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, Sylvia sat me down at the kitchen table with a folder of grocery receipts. Some of them predated our move-in by nearly a month. It's only fair, she said, sliding the folder toward me, since you're eating here now too. The total came to $220 for groceries purchased before I had ever set foot in that kitchen. I remember looking at the dates on the receipts and feeling something small and cold move through my chest, a flicker of a thought that didn't have words yet. I paid it anyway. Grant was in the next room. I didn't want to start a fight over grocery receipts 3 weeks into living under his mother's roof. I thought that was the ceiling. It wasn't. In early November, 2 days before the first hard frost, Sylvia told me the gutters needed clearing and repair, and that it had to be cash, because the contractor she used, a man named Terry who'd done work for the family for years, didn't take checks. $600, she said, handing me a business card with a number scrawled on the back. I drove to the bank that afternoon and withdrew it myself because Grant was at work and she said it needed to happen that day, or the pipes would freeze. I never met Terry. I never saw an invoice. I told myself that was normal, that older women sometimes ran their households on cash and handshake deals, that it wasn't my place to interrogate every transaction in a house I was only borrowing space in. I thought that was the ceiling. It wasn't. Later that same week, a bill arrived for a wedding gift. Sylvia's niece, a woman named Chloe Ferris, who I had met exactly once at our own wedding reception, was getting married in the spring, and Sylvia wanted to give a generous gift on behalf of the whole family, which apparently now included me. $250, she said, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned a leaking bathroom faucet that had been dripping for weeks and needed a plumber. Another $180, and could I possibly cover both since she was, in her words, a little stretched this month? I paid both. I want to be clear that at every single one of these moments, in isolation, saying no would have felt petty. That was the design of it, though I didn't have language for that yet. Each individual ask was small enough to argue against only if you were willing to look cruel doing it. In mid-November, a credit card statement arrived at the Maple Ridge house addressed to me for a store card I didn't remember opening, a home goods retailer called Bellwood Interiors. The balance was small, only $91, for a set of embroidered hand towels Sylvia had apparently purchased for the guest bathroom, since you're using it now too, and had put on an account opened, she explained when I asked, using my information from a form I'd signed months earlier at a bridal registry kiosk in that same store, a form I now understood had asked for far more than a registry required. I closed the card within the week and flagged it with the store's fraud department, who confirmed the application had listed my social security number, information I had never volunteered to Sylvia directly. At the time, I told myself it was a clerical overreach, an old woman filling out a form incorrectly. I didn't yet have a word for what it actually was. By Thanksgiving, the total sat at just under $3,000, and Sylvia found her biggest lever yet. Over dinner, in front of Renee, Grant's older sister who'd driven in from Dayton for the holiday, Sylvia set her fork down with a small, deliberate clink and said she'd been meaning to bring something up. Dr. Okafor doesn't love my numbers, she said, pressing a hand flat against her chest. Atrial fibrillation since the spring. It's manageable, they tell me, but it does make a person think about what happens to the house, to the family, if something happens to her. The table went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet when someone has planned a sentence and is waiting for the room to catch up. I want peace of mind, she continued, looking directly at me, her fork resting against her plate. I think Grant's name should be added to the deed on your house, Vivian, just to keep things simple for the family, in case anything ever happens to either of you. Grant sat next to me and said nothing, which somehow felt louder than if he'd spoken. I looked at him, waiting for him to say something, anything, in either direction, and he just kept his eyes on his plate, turning a piece of turkey over with his fork like it required his full attention. I need some time to think about anything involving my father's house, I said, keeping my voice even. Sylvia nodded slowly, the picture of gracious patience. Of course. I only hope you won't take too long. At my age, I don't know how much time I have to get my affairs in order. It was the kind of sentence built to sit in your chest for days. I want to be honest that it worked on me, at least a little, at least until I started doing what I do for a living, which is read the numbers instead of the story being told about them. A week after Thanksgiving, Sylvia asked me to host Chloe's bridal shower at the Maple Ridge house, since, she said, the dining room really is the nicest room for it, and it would mean so much to have you involved, now that you're part of things. I agreed, mostly because refusing felt disproportionate to the ask itself. The shower cost me another $310 in catering and decorations, money Sylvia promised to split with me later and never did. Grant, when I mentioned it, told me I was overthinking a party. It's one afternoon, he said. Why does everything have to be a transaction with you lately? That question stayed with me longer than he probably intended. I remember standing at the sink that night, washing punch bowls that weren't mine, in a kitchen that would never be mine, wondering when caring about where my own money went had become a character flaw instead of a reasonable thing to care about. There was a night in early December when I finally said something out loud, not about the money exactly, but about the pattern of it. Grant and I were getting ready for bed, and I told him I felt like a guest who was being billed for the privilege of staying. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "She's not trying to hurt you. She just doesn't know how to ask for help directly. Dad handled all of that for her for 30 years, and now she doesn't have anyone to do it, so she leans on us." I understood even then that he believed what he was saying. I also understood that believing it required him to not look too closely at the shape of what was actually happening in his own house. I let it go that night the way I'd let so many things go because it was midnight and I was tired, and because leaving a marriage over one uncomfortable conversation felt, at the time, like an overreaction I wasn't ready to have. By the time December arrived, I'd stopped being surprised by each new ask and started simply logging it, the way you log a recurring error in a system you no longer expect to fix on its own. That shift, from surprise to documentation, is its own kind of erosion, though I didn't recognize it as erosion at the time. I told myself I was being patient. I told myself I was being a good wife, a good daughter-in-law, someone who didn't make every inconvenience into a referendum on the marriage. It took the deed, cold and typed and missing my name entirely, to show me the difference between patience and a slow, deliberate kind of surrender. I'd been talked into one reasonable request at a time. By December 11th, 53 days after we'd moved in, I sat down with my notebook, the one I'd started keeping not out of suspicion, but out of habit, because tracking numbers is simply how my brain organizes a life. The total came to $3,400. Utilities, groceries, gutters, a wedding gift for a woman I'd met once, a faucet I never saw repaired. 53 days, $3,400. I sat with that number the way I'd sit with a discrepancy in a client's ledger, turning it over, looking for the innocent explanation, and not finding one. There was a small detail from a few weeks earlier that I hadn't thought much about until that moment, sitting with my notebook. In late October, an envelope had come to the Maple Ridge house addressed to Grant and Vivian Whitfield from a lender called Meridian Trust Bank. I'd assumed it was junk mail, one of those pre-approved offer mailers that flood a mailbox after any large purchase, and I'd tossed it into the recycling without opening it. I hadn't thought about it since, but sitting there with my notebook and my running total, something about it itched at the back of my mind. I couldn't say why yet. I just knew it belonged somewhere in the picture, even if I didn't have the whole picture assembled. On my lunch break the following Tuesday, I drove to the Cedar County Recorder's office instead of eating. I told myself I was being thorough, the same way I'd pull a title history on a client's property before signing off on a file. I requested the deed for the house at 118 Maple Ridge Road. Two names were on it: Grant Whitfield, Sylvia Whitfield. Mine was nowhere. Not one syllable, not a single line, not even as a tenant of record. I had been paying rent in installments disguised as favors and family obligations on a house I would never own a single brick of. While I was there, on instinct more than plan, I pulled the property tax records for Maple Ridge Road as well. Sylvia had claimed the homestead exemption on the house solely under her own name, filed the previous spring, months before Grant and I had even gotten engaged, which told me this arrangement, or some version of it, had been in her head long before it had ever reached mine. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because everything else in my chest felt like it had come loose. The back of my neck went cold in a way I recognized from work, the specific chill that comes when a spreadsheet finally admits what it's been hiding. I called Marisol from the parking lot, mostly because I needed to say the numbers out loud to another person before I could decide what to do with them. She didn't tell me to leave him. She didn't tell me anything, really. She just listened, and at the end she said, "You already know what you're going to do. You're just gathering the nerve to do it your way instead of the fast way." She was right. That was exactly what the next 5 weeks became. A slow, deliberate assembly of proof instead of a single loud exit I might have regretted the shape of later. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I didn't say anything to Grant that night. I want to explain why, because I think it matters. I am not a person who explodes. I am a person who verifies. 10 years of reading financial documents for a living had taught me that the worst thing you can do when you suspect a pattern is tip your hand before you understand the full shape of it. So I kept paying attention. I kept the notebook. I kept smiling. 2 weeks later, on December 3rd, I came home from a long call with a client and set my phone down on the dresser without thinking, still recording a voice memo I'd forgotten to stop after transcribing some notes for work. I didn't realize it until that night, folding laundry, when I picked the phone up to check the time and saw it had been recording for almost 40 minutes. I almost deleted it without listening. It felt like an accident, an invasion of privacy, even if it was my own bedroom. Something made me press play instead. The first few minutes were nothing. Footsteps, a door, the sound of the television downstairs, and then Grant's voice, closer to the vent that connected our bedroom to the kitchen below, the same vent that had always carried sound strangely through that old house. "If she adds me to the deed, we can refinance," he said. "Pull equity out of her house. We could clear the roof repairs on this place, maybe help Mom with the property taxes too." Then Sylvia, calm, almost pleased with herself. "She trusts you," she said. "Use that." I stood in the middle of my bedroom, laundry basket against my hip, and listened to those 4 words 3 times before I set the phone down. Everything rearranged itself in that moment, the way a photograph does when you finally see the trick of it, the vase and the 2 faces at the same time. name. The utilities, the groceries, the gutters, the wedding gift, Chloe Ferris, the faucet. The heart condition brought up at exactly the right dinner. The Meridian Trust Bank envelope I'd thrown away in October, which I now understood wasn't junk mail at all, but a preliminary refinance inquiry, likely built using information Grant had access to from our joint tax filing that spring. My social security number included on a document he'd need only to make a lender take the request seriously enough to send paperwork. None of it had been coincidence. Every bill, every ask, every soft, reasonable request had been designed to do one of two things: drain me financially or wear me down emotionally until adding Grant's name to my father's house felt like the path of least resistance instead of what it actually was, which was surrender. The next morning, before I called anyone else, I called Meridian Trust Bank directly, using the customer service line, and asked carefully whether any application or inquiry had been filed under my name in the past 2 months. The representative couldn't share full details without a longer identity verification process, but she confirmed enough for my purposes. An inquiry had been opened on October 29th under a joint application listing both Grant Whitfield and Vivian Whitfield, requesting a preliminary rate quote for a cash-out refinance on the property at 42 Larkspur Lane. I hadn't authorized it. I hadn't signed it. My signature, when I finally saw the application months later during discovery, was a passable forgery, close enough to fool a glance, wrong enough that any document examiner would flag it inside minutes. That was the moment the last piece of doubt left me. This wasn't a family being overly involved in my finances. This was fraud, dressed up in casserole dishes and cardiologist appointments. The next morning, I called an attorney named Patricia Voss, 14 years in family law, whose name I'd gotten from a colleague at Ashcroft and Weiss who'd gone through a difficult divorce the year before. I sat in her office on a Wednesday afternoon and told her everything, in order, the way I'd lay out a case file. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she asked me a single question. "What do you do for work?" "Financial compliance," I said. "Forensic document review." She almost smiled. "Then you already know exactly what we're going to build." Patricia laid out the strategy plainly. We wouldn't confront Grant or Sylvia yet. We wouldn't tip them off, wouldn't let a moment of anger undo weeks of careful documentation. Instead, we'd let the pattern keep happening, because a pattern still in motion is easier to prove than one that's already stopped. She also flagged the forged signature as a separate, more serious issue, one that could, if I chose to pursue it, involve the county prosecutor's office and not just a family court judge. I told her I wanted to think about that part. Divorce felt like something I could survive. Turning my mother-in-law into a criminal defendant felt like something else entirely. A door I wasn't sure I wanted to walk through, even though I had every right to. We spent the next 5 weeks building it in silence. I kept the notebook, now formalized into a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and a running total that eventually reached $3,800 by mid-January. I kept a certified copy of the Maple Ridge deed showing my name absent from it. I had the recording authenticated by a forensic audio expert Patricia knew, a formality that took 72 hours and confirmed what I already knew, that the voices were Grant's and Sylvia's, that the recording hadn't been altered, that the timestamp was accurate. 3 exhibits. One marriage quietly converting itself into evidence. The hardest part of those 5 weeks wasn't the paperwork. It was the dinner table. I sat across from Grant 3 nights a week and asked about his day. I passed Sylvia the bread and asked how her cardiologist appointment had gone. I performed a version of myself that suspected nothing, and I was, if I can say so honestly, very good at it. It is a strange thing to discover you have talent for something you never wanted to practice. One evening in late December, Sylvia asked me, over dishes, whether I'd given any more thought to the deed conversation from Thanksgiving. I told her I was still weighing it carefully, that a decision that permanent deserved time. She smiled, told me she appreciated how seriously I took the family's well-being, and squeezed my hand on the counter. I let her hold it for exactly as long as felt natural, and then I excused myself to bed, went upstairs, and updated my spreadsheet by the light of my phone instead of the lamp, so no shadow would show under the door. Which brings the story back to that Sunday in January, the dinner I opened with, January 11th, Sylvia's smirk, her demand that I cover every bill in the house since I lived under her roof. My answer, delivered with a smile I'd rehearsed more than I want to admit, that I'd simply move back into the house I already owned. What I didn't include, the first time I told you about that dinner, was what happened in the 60 seconds after. Grant found his voice first, though it came out cracked, barely holding together. "How much did you hear?" he asked. "Not what do you mean, not are you serious, just that." A question that only makes sense if you already know there's something to have heard. "Enough," I said. Sylvia recovered faster than he did, her chin lifting, her voice smoothing back into its usual composed register. "You're misunderstanding something, Vivian. This is a family conversation. It doesn't need to turn into a scene. I've paid $3,800, I said, for a house I don't own a single square foot of. Whose name is on that deed, Sylvia?" Nobody answered. The silence answered for her, the way silence does when a question has only one honest response, and no one at the table is brave enough to give it. "It's not fraud," Sylvia said too quickly, the word landing before I'd even used it. "It was going to be discussed properly eventually when the time was right." "The time was right in October," I said, "when someone forged my signature on a refinance application at Meridian Trust Bank. Was that the discussion you meant?" Grant's head turned toward his mother so fast I heard his neck crack faintly. faintly. "You told me it was just a rate inquiry," he said, and for the first time all night his voice had an edge in it that wasn't aimed at me. "You said it wasn't binding. You said nobody would need to sign anything real until she agreed." "Someone signed something," I said. "It just wasn't me." Sylvia's mouth tightened into a thin line, and for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have a soft, reasonable sentence ready to smooth the moment over. She just sat there, and in the silence, I watched Grant realize, in real time, that his mother had gone further than even he'd agreed to. It was, I think, the first honest moment I ever saw pass between the two of them. A crack finally showing in a partnership that had always presented itself to me as seamless. I stood up from the table. I told them both calmly that my things were already packed, which was true. My suitcase had been sitting in the trunk of my car for 2 days. My passport had come out of the nightstand drawer a week earlier. Grant's voice cracked again behind me as I walked toward the door. "We weren't going to do it right away," he said. "We thought if you moved out for a while, felt uncertain enough, maybe unstable enough, you'd come around to adding your house to both our names. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "That's not a misunderstanding," I said, turning back just long enough to look at him. "That's a strategy, and I read strategies for a living, Grant. You picked the one person who was guaranteed to eventually notice." I took my laptop, my keys, my phone, and I walked out into a cold Sunday night, and I didn't look back at the house on Maple Ridge Road, because for the first time in 4 months, I understood I had never actually belonged inside it. The next morning, at 8:12, they were both in my driveway on Larkspur Lane. The Delgado's lease still had 4 months left on it, so I'd been staying at a friend's guest room the night before, but I'd driven over that morning to drop off a set of spare keys with my tenants, and Grant and Sylvia had apparently been waiting. Grant stood in front, Sylvia a half step behind him, chin already lifted, already talking before I'd fully gotten out of the car. "You are throwing away your entire marriage," she said, "over a misunderstanding." I looked at her through the gap in the storm door I'd stepped behind, chains still latched, more out of instinct than actual fear. "Then let me play you something," I said. I held up my phone. I pressed play. Grant's voice filled the cold air between us, tinny through the small speaker but unmistakable. Refinance, equity. Then Sylvia's voice, and her small, satisfied laugh, and the 4 words that had ended everything for me 2 weeks earlier. "She trusts you. Use that." Sylvia's face changed first, the composure sliding off it in real time, replaced by something closer to fear than anger. Grant's face went the same sheet white it had gone at the dinner table, except this time there was no dining room full of assumed privacy to soften it. This time Renee was there too, having driven over that morning at Grant's request, apparently, to help talk sense into me, and I watched her face change as well, watched her look at her mother with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself 24 hours earlier. She didn't say anything in that moment. She didn't need to. She turned and walked back to her car without another word to her mother, and the sound of her driver's door closing was, in its own way, as loud as anything spoken that morning. "What do you want from us?" Grant asked, his voice shaking in a way I'd never heard from him before, not once in 2 years. Sylvia found her voice again before I could answer. "You could still fix this," she said. "Families forgive things. That's what families are for." I looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who'd hugged me in that kitchen in September and called me part of the family, and I thought about how many different things people mean when they use that word. I almost told him. I had a list, if I'm honest. I almost told him I wanted an apology that didn't have an angle attached to it, wanted to understand at what point loving someone had turned, in his mind, into a resource to be managed, but I didn't say any of that. Some sentences aren't worth spending on people who've already shown you they won't hear them. Instead, I closed the storm door, and I turned the deadbolt, and I stood in my own front hallway, in my own house, and listened to the sound of my locks doing exactly what they were built to do. I stood there for a long time after their car finally pulled out of the driveway, longer than the moment probably deserved. My hands were shaking now, in a way they hadn't been in the recorder's office parking lot weeks earlier, as if my body had waited until it was safe to finally register what it had been carrying. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink and sat at my own kitchen table, in my own house, and let the quiet settle over me before I called Patricia to tell her it was done. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected and slower than I wanted, both at once. Patricia filed for divorce on my behalf on January 20th, citing the recorded conversation and the deed history as part of the record, not because Ohio required fault to be established, but because I wanted it documented, formally, permanently, in a way no one could later reframe as a misunderstanding. Grant contested almost nothing. I think by that point, even he understood there wasn't a version of events where he came out looking like anything other than what he was. Renee called me 11 days after the driveway confrontation. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another attempt on behalf of the family to smooth things over, to ask me to reconsider, to suggest that maybe I was being harsh about a mother trying to protect her son's marriage. Instead, she told me something I hadn't expected. 6 years earlier, not long after their father Walter died, Sylvia had tried something similar with Renee's own house, a 2-bedroom bungalow in Dayton that Renee had bought with her ex-husband before their divorce. Sylvia had pushed, gently and then not so gently, for Renee to add Grant's name to that deed too, framed as protecting family assets after Walter's death, framed as keeping things simple. Renee had refused. The relationship between her and Sylvia had never fully recovered from that refusal. 6 years of holiday dinners conducted at a careful, wounded distance. I should have warned warned you," Renee said. "I told myself it was different this time. I told myself you seemed too sharp for it to work on you. I'm sorry I let that be an excuse instead of a warning." I didn't blame her, not really, though it took me a while to say that out loud instead of just thinking it. It's a strange thing, discovering that a pattern you thought was unique to your own marriage had a rehearsal 6 years earlier, on a different house, with a different daughter-in-law who happened to be a son instead, a different set of circumstances wearing the exact same shape. I called my mother that same week back in Arizona, where she and my stepfather had retired 2 years earlier. She didn't say much when I told her everything, which isn't like her, and it took me a moment to realize she was crying quietly on the other end of the line. "Your father would have driven out there himself," she said finally, half laughing through it. "He never trusted a house with 2 names that weren't married to each other." It was such a small, strange thing to say, but it undid me more than almost anything else that week. This idea that some instinct I'd inherited from my father, the same instinct that made me pull a title report on my own lunch break, might have come from him watching people misuse property and trust his whole life, long before I ever needed the lesson myself. Chloe Ferris reached out in early March, a message I didn't expect from a woman I'd met exactly once, at my own wedding. She'd heard a version of what happened through the family grapevine, filtered and softened, she assumed, but she wanted me to know something anyway. 2 years earlier, before her own engagement, Sylvia had approached her about a family investment opportunity involving a small rental property and had asked Chloe for $4,000 toward a down payment, promising a share of the rental income in return. Chloe had said no, mostly because her fiancé at the time had been suspicious of the paperwork Sylvia produced, paperwork that listed only Sylvia's name as owner, despite the pitch being framed as a joint family venture. "I always felt a little guilty for saying no," Chloe wrote. "Reading between the lines of what happened to you, I don't feel guilty anymore. It was a small thing, a message from someone I barely knew, but it mattered more than I expected. It meant the pattern wasn't just Renee's story, or mine. It was simply who Sylvia was, applied consistently to anyone who stood close enough to be useful." Sylvia didn't take the divorce filing quietly. In early February, she called my office at Ashcroft & Weiss and asked to speak to my supervisor, a woman named Carol Amos, and told her, according to Carol's later, slightly bewildered retelling, that I was unstable and vindictive, and that my colleagues should be aware I was capable of manufacturing evidence against people who loved me. Carol, to her credit, listened politely, thanked Sylvia for the call, and then walked directly to my desk to tell me about it, laughing slightly at the strangeness of it, not realizing until she saw my face that it wasn't strange to me at all. It was exactly the kind of move I'd expected, once I understood who I was actually dealing with. When cornered, a person like Sylvia doesn't examine what she did. She examines who might be convinced to doubt the person she did it to. A few of my coworkers found out about the call secondhand, and for a week or two, I caught sympathetic glances in the break room that I didn't particularly want but understood. Carol, for her part, never brought it up again except once, months later, to tell me quietly that she respected how I'd handled the entire situation without ever raising my voice in the office, not once. 2 weeks after that, Sylvia showed up unannounced at Larkspur Lane, this time alone, while the Delgados were finishing out the last of their lease, and I was mid-negotiation with them about an early move-out date, since I'd offered to cover a portion of their relocation costs in exchange for getting my house back sooner. Sylvia stood on my porch and told me, through the closed door, that I was breaking her son's heart, that family didn't do this to family, that she hoped I'd think about what I was destroying before it was too late to undo it. I didn't open the door. I called Patricia instead, who sent a formal letter within the week, reminding Sylvia, in language far more precise than mine would have been, that any further unannounced contact could be treated as harassment and documented accordingly. Sylvia never came to the house again. Negotiating with the Delgados took a gentler kind of patience. They were good tenants, quiet, always on time with rent, and I didn't want to strong-arm them out of a lease they'd signed in good faith. I met with them in person at the house in early March, sat at my own kitchen table for the first time in 9 months, and offered to cover their moving costs and 1 month's rent at a comparable place nearby if they'd be willing to relocate by the end of April instead of August. Mrs. Delgado, a soft-spoken woman named Anna, told me she'd wondered, gently, over the past few months, why I always seemed to call about the house instead of my husband. I didn't explain everything. I just told her things had changed and that I needed to come home. She said she understood completely and that her own mother had once needed the exact same kind of coming home. We shook hands on it that afternoon, and I drove away from Larkspur Lane for the first time in a long time without dreading what waited for me at the other house. In late February, I heard secondhand, through Renee, that Sylvia had gone to Pastor Dunlop at Cedar Falls Community Church, the congregation the Whitfield family had attended for decades, and asked him to reach out to me directly, framing the divorce as a young wife abandoning her family duties over what she called a paperwork misunderstanding. Pastor Dunlop, to his credit, called me once gently, mostly to check that I was safe and cared for, rather than to relitigate anything, and when I gave him the barest outline of what had actually happened, he apologized for the call and told me he wouldn't be raising it again. I never heard from the church after that. I don't know exactly what Sylvia told the rest of the congregation, and I've stopped wondering. Some stories aren't mine to correct anymore. There was a joint checking account too, one Grant and I had opened together in October to manage household expenses at Maple Ridge Road, the same account I'd been funneling utility payments and grocery reimbursements into for 4 months. Untangling it took longer than I expected, mostly because Grant's attorney, a young associate at a firm in Cedar Falls, initially argued that the funds in the account, including the $1,450 a month in Larkspur Lane rental income I'd been depositing there, should be considered marital property subject to equal division. Patricia disagreed forcefully and produced my notebook, now formatted into a clean, dated ledger showing every dollar that had gone in and where it had originated. There was a 2-hour mediation session in March in a conference room in downtown Cedar Falls, where Grant sat across the table from me for the first time since the driveway, flanked by his attorney, saying almost nothing while the lawyers argued over whose money had ever really been whose. I watched him more than I listened to the arguments. He looked smaller than I remembered him, like a man who'd finally run out of rooms to hide in. It took 3 weeks of back and forth, but by the end, I recovered the full balance, including every dollar I'd paid toward a house I'd never owned. It felt less like a financial victory, and more like watching a wound finally, properly close. The forged signature took longer to resolve than the checking account did. Patricia and I went back and forth for weeks about whether to escalate it to the county prosecutor's office, and in the end, I chose a narrower path. I filed a formal fraud report with Meridian Trust Bank's Internal Investigations Unit, providing the authenticated recording and the deed history as supporting context. The bank closed the inquiry, flagged the application as fraudulent in their internal system, and sent written confirmation that no refinance had ever been processed and no lien had ever attached to Larkspur Lane. I decided not to pursue criminal charges against Sylvia directly, not out of forgiveness, but out of a colder calculation. A criminal case would have taken over a year, would have required Grant to testify against his own mother in open court, and would have kept me tethered to the Whitfield family in a courtroom long after I wanted to be free of them in every other way. Patricia told me it was a reasonable call. She also told me, quietly, that she'd seen clients make the opposite choice and regret it just as often. There isn't a clean formula for justice. There's just the version you can live with afterward, and I chose the one that let me close the door faster. Last I heard through Renee, Sylvia sold the Maple Ridge house that fall and moved into a smaller condo across town. The upkeep on a 5-bedroom colonial apparently too much for one person to manage without a second income helping to cover it. I don't know if she ever tried the same approach with anyone else, whether some other daughter-in-law or niece or unsuspecting family friend is sitting somewhere right now with a folder of receipts they haven't quite added up yet. I hope for whatever it's worth that she didn't have the chance. Somewhere in the middle of all of it, on a Tuesday evening in late February, I let myself grieve, actually grieve, for the first time since the driveway. I was sitting in my empty living room at Larkspur Lane, boxes still stacked against one wall, waiting for the Delgado's lease to officially end, and I found an old photo on my phone from our honeymoon. Grant laughing on a beach in a way that had felt, at the time, like the beginning of something solid. I cried for almost an hour, not for the man who'd asked how much I'd heard, but for the version of him I genuinely believed existed, the one who called his mother every day because he loved her, not because he'd never learned how to separate loving her from obeying her. That man might never have existed at all, or maybe he had, briefly, before Sylvia's need for control reasserted itself the way it apparently always had, with Renee's house, and now with mine. I let myself think, too, about the small good things, the way he used to leave the porch light on when I worked late, the way he'd learned my coffee order without ever being told. Grief doesn't ask permission to include the good parts along with the bad. It just insists on the whole picture, and I let it for that one evening, before I closed the lid on the last box and went to bed in a house that was, for the first time in months, entirely and only mine. Grant reached out once in early April, a single text message that read, in full, "I know sorry doesn't fix it. I'm sorry anyway. I let her make me smaller than I wanted to be." I read it 4 times. I didn't respond right away, and when I finally did 3 days later, I wrote back only, "I believe you meant that. It doesn't change anything." I still think that was true on both counts. I do believe some part of him meant it. It didn't change a single thing about what he'd done or what I needed to do next, which was finish the process of separating my life from his as cleanly as the law would allow. There was one brief hearing in April, procedural more than dramatic, where a judge in Cedar County reviewed the settlement terms Patricia and Grant's attorney had already hammered out, terms that left me with full ownership of Larkspur Lane, unencumbered, along with the recovered checking account funds. Grant sat 2 rows behind me in the gallery and didn't try to catch my eye once. It took 11 minutes. I remember thinking, walking out of that courthouse into a cold, ordinary Tuesday, that 11 minutes was a strange, small amount of time to formally end something that had taken 4 months to build and 4 months to unravel. I started seeing a therapist that spring, a woman named Dr. Priya Nair, mostly because Marisol insisted, and mostly because I recognized, somewhere around February, that I was handling the legal and financial side of the divorce with more composure than I was handling the actual grief of it. Dr. Nair didn't try to talk me out of the sadness. She mostly just asked good questions, the kind that made me sit with why a woman who reads financial fraud for a living had still missed the fraud happening in her own kitchen. The answer we eventually landed on together wasn't that I'd been careless. It was that I'd been trained by every family model I'd ever seen to treat a mother's love for her son as evidence of decency by association. I hadn't accounted for a mother whose love and control had fused into the same instinct so completely that she couldn't tell them apart herself. The divorce was finalized on May 6th. It took less time time than I'd braced for, mostly because Grant, by the end, seemed to want it over as much as I did, exhausted in his own way by a mother whose love had always come wrapped around a fist. The Delgados moved out at the end of April, and I moved back into 42 Larkspur Lane on the first Saturday in May, carrying boxes up the same front steps I'd walked away from 9 months earlier as a newly married woman with no idea what she'd married into. I still work at Ashcroft & Weiss. I got promoted that summer to lead a small team that reviews exactly the kind of documents that saved me, deeds and disclosures, and the fine print buried in agreements that most people sign without reading closely enough. There's a specific satisfaction in that work now that I didn't have before, a sense that the skill I use every day at the office is the same skill that once, quietly, in a bedroom over a laundry basket, saved the rest of my life. My life now is quieter than I expected grief to allow. I refinished the back porch at Larkspur Lane myself over the summer, sanded the railings down to bare wood, and repainted them a deep forest green my father would have liked. I started running again, something I'd let slide during the marriage without noticing when or why. Most evenings I sit out there with a cup of coffee and watch the street settle into dusk, and I don't think about Maple Ridge Road nearly as often as I once assumed I would. I talk to Renee occasionally, mostly texts, sometimes coffee when she's in Cedar Falls visiting old friends. We don't talk about Sylvia much. There isn't a version of that conversation that goes anywhere new. I understand now that Sylvia isn't a cartoon villain twirling a mustache. She's a woman who lost her husband and built her sense of safety around controlling the people closest to her, who genuinely believes, I think, that everything she did was protection rather than theft. That doesn't make it forgivable, it just makes it explainable, which is a different thing, and a colder one. I haven't spoken to Grant since the divorce was finalized. I don't wish him harm. I mostly just hope, in the distant, uncomplicated way you hope for a stranger, that he eventually finds the version of himself that exists outside his mother's expectations, if that version is even still in there somewhere. I think about Marisol's question from that bridal shop parking lot more than I expected to, the one about every wedding conversation somehow circling back to what the Whitfield family had always done. I think about how easy it is when you love someone to mistake inherited habits for personality, to assume the shape of a family is simply the shape of the person you married, immovable and separate from choice. It isn't. Grant made choices every step of the way, even when he framed them to himself as loyalty instead of complicity. I've had to make my own peace with the fact that I missed it for as long as I did, not because I was foolish, but because trust, by design, isn't supposed to come with an audit trail. That's what made it work on someone like me, of all people, someone who audits things for a living. I'm not embarrassed by that anymore. I understand now that the con was built for exactly my kind of carefulness, and it still didn't survive contact with it. That, I've decided, is the only kind of vindication that ever really mattered to me in the end. I think, too, about the dinner where this all started, the one I keep returning to whenever I tell this story out loud. Sylvia's smirk wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was confidence. The confidence of someone who had run this exact play before and never once had it fail. I've wondered since whether some small part of her almost respected me in the moment I said no, the way you respect an opponent who finally sees the board clearly. I doubt it. I think, more likely, she simply recalculated, the way she always did, already halfway toward the next angle before Grant's face had even finished going pale. What I know now, sitting in my own living room in my own house with my father's name still somewhere on the original paperwork in a drawer in my office, is this. Trust isn't supposed to be a strategy someone else gets to use against you. It's supposed to be the one thing in a marriage that doesn't have an angle attached to it. When someone tells you, quietly, to a third party, that your trust is a resource to be used, they've already told you everything you need to know about how they see you. I just happen to be the kind of person who was listening when they said it. There's a version of that Sunday dinner that still visits me sometimes, late at night, the version where I imagine saying it differently, softer, giving them a chance to explain themselves into something forgivable. But I don't think that version would have changed the ending. Some sentences only work because they're final. Mine was. I would move back into the house I already owned. I did. I still live there. Some nights, sitting in the quiet of it, I let myself miss the marriage I thought I was building, even knowing now it was never real in the way I needed it to be. That loss is mine to carry, and I carry it honestly, without pretending the peace I have now erases what it cost to get here. Some nights I think about the version of Sylvia who might have simply asked me for help, honestly, without the spreadsheet of manufactured emergencies behind it, and I think I would have said yes to some of it, freely, willingly, the way you help family you actually trust. She never gave me the chance to find out. That, more than the money, is the part I still can't quite let go of.